My role here today is to give you a little bit of background into what scenario planning and scenarios are all about, to hopefully help engage you in the efforts that you're going to participate in after Lucy gets finished talking about the charge for the day. You all are going to be participating in probably one of the most important discussions that has been held in the state in a long, long time today. You're going to help us look with all of your different perspectives at what the future might be under certain circumstances. And in those discussions, give us the raw data that we're going to need to create a set of scenarios. And this may be an iterative process over the next several months to create stories that will resonate with the general population here in the Middle Rio Grande region and hopefully across the state to better prepare ourselves for the future in terms of water use and perhaps even energy use. And that's why this great title, Choosing Our Future, is an appropriate one for the meeting today. Let's talk a little bit about what scenarios are. They're really stories that are intended to stretch the imagination of the community, organizations, or groups that use this particular planning tool to help them better understand the complex environment that they live in, and to better prepare themselves as events occur and understand how different events and indicators that might be occurring in their outside world are leading down a path that might require action to be taken. They're also a way to identify, discuss, and prepare for uncertain futures. And certainly the story, which is in your packet and that was the subject of last year's water assembly, is something that opens one's eyes to what a possible future might be if we just pursue the course that we're on today. When I first got engaged with the water assembly folks, Bob and Kevin and John and Lucy, only a few months ago, one of the first things I did was pull down the story and read it. And it made me nervous because the one section in here where it talks about the drought that had occurred in 2017, it said swaths of bottomland cottonwoods turned terminally brown, along with holdout suburban lawns. And I had just removed about 1,500 square feet of lawn in my house using one of those sod removers, so I knew exactly what that was about. And all of the turf at Albuquerque's 2 remaining golf courses. And I went, oh my God. There's a nightmare scenario that we certainly don't want to have to face in the future if we can do something to avoid it. And so the power of stories is what scenarios is all about. It stirs the imagination, it raises the emotions, and it drives individuals and groups and communities to action about possible futures and strategies that might allow us to change those futures. As such, scenarios can be a long view into a world of great uncertainty. And this term, a long view, is a term of art that was coined by Peter Schwartz, who is the principal of Global Business Network. And I'll have a reference later to his seminary work, The Art of the Long View, which describes how scenario planning can be used in the context that we're using it today. By the way, copies of this presentation will be provided to everybody after when we start the breakout session, so all of the web references in here you'll have on that hard copy. There are also stories about the way the world might turn out tomorrow, a way to allow people to say, I'm prepared for whatever happens, because the conversations that occur in the creation of scenarios allows people to imagine those things that might occur and what actions might be taken to either change them or to address them and make the world a better place. They also change a person's view of reality, and the diversity of folks that we have in the room today, we're going to have many different realities. Everybody has their own filter of what the world looks like. And that's why it's so important to have a diverse group, many different opinions represented. And hopefully in your breakout sessions today, we'll have a comfortable dialogue with different opinions being voiced, and our facilitators will try to capture everybody's perspective. Scenarios are also a method to achieve better decisions. For policymakers, they provide that peripheral vision that many times they don't have, so that they have a better idea of the entire world that they're dealing with. And over the years, as I've done scenario planning for different groups, I always try to encourage them to come to me with other descriptors of what scenarios are. I actually have a list of about 100 of these bullets. But one of the ones that I liked in all the years I've been doing scenario planning is that scenarios are a modern day hearth for people to gather around and talk about what might be. So what is scenario planning? It actually is a tool that's been refined over the past 20 years that has certain methodologies associated with it. And each of your facilitators will help guide you through your breakout sessions this morning so that you can give us the information that is in your heads and in your experiences so that we can put it all together. It allows leaders to stretch their imagination and anticipate and prepare for probable futures, and to speculate on improbable futures. As John mentioned, one of the most famous scenario efforts that has been done in the past 20 years was accomplished in South Africa in the 1990-91 time frame. And I do have a web reference in the handout that you'll get today, and it's called the Mont Fleur Scenarios. This is the entire document here, which includes a very informative 3-page executive summary that describes the process. This scenario effort was conducted at a time in South Africa when apartheid was literally tearing apart the country. Nelson Mandela had just been released from jail, and there was fears that there was going to be a civil revolution in the country of South Africa. The politicians and government at the time decided that they would engage the general public in a broad series of discussions about the future. And in particular, they created a scenario planning group that involved almost all of the parties, disparate parties in South Africa at the time, to take a look at what the future might look like under different circumstances. And using the scenario planning process, they created 4 future worlds that described what might happen. One of those future worlds, which they called the Flight of the Flamingos, was a world in which all the parties worked together to create a new social infrastructure and an abandonment of apartheid, essentially. The other worlds were different versions, one of which was a socialist government, one of which was an oppressive government that maintained apartheid, and the other one was a government that said it was going to eliminate apartheid, but then really didn't. In the creation over a period of a year of those scenarios, there was a broad public engagement and discussion that occurred. involving many politicians, many people from different walks of life. And a set of stories was written, very short stories, about a page and a half each, that described what each one of those future worlds might look like. That set of scenarios was then published in the biggest newspaper in South Africa. Copies of the scenarios were given to schools and churches and put in supermarkets and distributed broadly across South Africa, and became the subject of public discussion. Sermons were given about the differences between the scenarios in churches. And what it did was it created a common language and an understanding among the population that assisted the de Klerk government to abandon apartheid. That really is a powerful demonstration of the scenario process and what it can do to help mobilize community, even though there are tremendous differences in opinion and approaches, to get to a future that is beneficial for everybody. And that's what we hope to do today, to begin today with our scenario process. We need to say a little bit about what scenarios are not. They are absolutely not about predicting the future. Nobody can predict the future. It's really, really hard when we're doing scenario planning to not use the term predict, particularly as we talk about events that might lead to a future world. In my past experience, in the past 16 years of doing scenario planning for major corporations, the national labs, and federal agencies, there's been about a half a dozen times when we created a set of scenarios and timelines to the future where we monitored external events that were occurring. And as a result of a number of external events occurring sequentially that actually fit a particular timeline, we were able to say, my goodness, this is exactly what we talked about. And what we said is, if these three things happen, or four things happen, this is what the result was going to be. We were very careful not to say, this is what's going to happen. We said, this might happen. And in several of those cases, the next event occurred, some of which had world-changing influence. When those things occur in scenario planning, it sends a tingle up your spine. But the remarkable thing that happens is the people that are engaged in those scenarios don't panic. They don't get emotional. The first response is, well, okay, we said that that's probably what was going to happen because of these events. What was it that we said we should be doing if that actually occurred? And because you've rehearsed those discussions, you can make logical decisions, not emotional decisions, to make the world a better place. So scenarios aren't an accurate picture of tomorrow. They're not a science, although we use orthogonal axes to create our scenarios. And they're not conceived of one at a time. It's an iterative process that we have to go through, as you'll see today when we do this. Scenarios have a rich history. The first time they were used effectively outside of the military was with Royal Dutch Shell in the 1970s. The strategic planning director at the time, Pierre Wack, for Royal Dutch Shell, was dabbling in the use of what was called wargaming theory that was used by the military dating back to even prior to World War II. And he felt that there was a richness in the wargaming process that could be used in the private sector. And what he did was he engaged the executives of Royal Dutch Shell in an exercise that took them outside of their normal discussion and their normal worlds and said, what would happen if there was a crisis in the Middle East in oil and there was a shortage of oil? What should Royal Dutch Shell be doing today if that were to happen in the future? And although there was some concern in the executive team that this was too artsy and too wild. They did hold those discussions, and they identified a number of strategies that wouldn't hurt Royal Dutch Shell to use, that would better prepare them just in case that might happen. Well, when the oil crisis hit in '73, Royal Dutch Shell was the only oil company that was prepared for that. And they went from number 8 in the world to number 3 in the world as a result of that planning. And Pierre wrote a Harvard Business Review article called The Gentle Art of Reperceiving, which is sort of a term of art now used for scenario planning, and is sort of the seminary work that was done in scenario planning for the current time. Another study of Pierre was Peter Schwartz, and he took over from Pierre at Royal Dutch Shell to help guide the scenario planning process. And in the late 80s, early 90s, Peter felt that scenario planning is something that could be used by a lot of organizations and companies worldwide, so he decided to start his own company in Berkeley, California, called Global Business Network. And you see gbn.com is the website for that. And he wrote a seminal piece of work called The Art of the Long View. It's no longer in print, but you can typically go to Amazon and get used copies. It's a very easy read. It's also in audio tape. And it's a great, great work even today to get an understanding of the power of scenario planning, particularly on the audio tape when you get all of the nuances from Peter being added. And as I mentioned, as time went on, activities like the Mont Fleur Scenarios demonstrated how powerful scenario planning actually is. As an aside, I usually put on this slide a story. About 2 years prior to 9/11, there was a military Army scenario planning exercise that was undertaken, more of a wargaming exercise, but scenario planning in its scope, where the teams took a path to the future, where terrorists hijacked simultaneously multiple commercial airliners and flew them into high-value targets. Only a couple of hours into that scenario discussion, a general stepped in and said, wait a minute, this is too crazy. This will never happen. Let's put this one aside and restart the activity. Well, didn't get a lot of press after 9/11, as you can imagine, because it was a little perhaps embarrassing, but it was resurrected. And it's an example of how, when you do scenario planning, you shouldn't let the constraints of your normal world hold you down in terms of expressing ideas. As I talked to the facilitation team this morning, I said, well, let's not go too deeply into aliens landed in 2025 with a new energy source and everything was solved and we could make water and things like that. That's a little bit too wild and beyond the imagination. But let's not hold anybody back, though, that might have ideas that some of the others think is too outrageous, because we don't want to miss an opportunity like was missed prior to 9/11 to rehearse that possible future. Scenarios require a lot of work, not just building them, but also using them in a way that creates value. And so these are some of the things that I've discovered over the years when I work with different clients in doing scenario planning, to make sure they understand that this isn't a one-off event. This is something that, for it to be of real value, has to be taken by the water assembly and the folks that are engaged in this process, and massaged and used throughout the year. As John mentioned, one of the possible follow-ons to this might be a town hall a year from now that would bring 100 or so people together. And the scenarios that you contribute to today could very well be a basis for that town hall. to set the stage for the folks that participate in that town hall, to let them better understand what the future might look like. As I talked to the facilitation team this morning, if we can generate a good set of scenarios from the work that you do today, we'll have a whole year to look at current events that are occurring, and we can actually map vectors into each one of the future worlds that you create and talk about those to basically look back on a year's worth of time as to how well we crafted the future worlds and which direction that we're headed in. So one of the important things in doing scenario work is that you quickly become aware that you have a filter. Everything that you experience in life, even the newspaper stories that you choose to read and the ones that you choose to skip over, are run through that filter. And that's why it's so important for scenarios to be effective, to have a great diversity of input. You have to have people with a lot of different filters. I always cringe when I have clients that come to me and say, hey, we hear you do scenarios. Can you do a set of scenarios for us? And I say, no, I can't. Because it takes you and your group and others outside of your group to really create a set of effective scenarios. So educating yourself on the views of others is important. Listening to what others have as an opinion, whether it's scientifically based or emotionally based, it's an opinion that needs to be listened to. It does take a lot of research to keep scenarios alive and to understand where they're headed. Keeping track of new technologies is a critical aspect of the future. It's one of the most important drivers of the future of mankind, and so we have to understand technology. And that's why it's important in doing scenarios that you have university participation, private sector participation, particularly in terms of technologies and new scientific knowledge. Scenarios also require an understanding of what many people call the fringes. These are the small groups, typically the vociferous ones, that are raising their voices because of something that bothers them. I think we have some of that going on right now on campus. And in that context, technology through social networking is a critical aspect of scenario planning as we've entered the 21st century. So what I do is I encourage many of my clients to use social networking effectively to continue to gather input on scenarios and that diversity of opinion that's so critical in terms of understanding where the future is. Lucy will talk a little bit about the driving forces. We try to categorize these a little bit to help you identify what the driving forces of the future are into these categories. Vocabulary, imagery, and rhythm. This is where we lose a lot of technical people when we do scenario planning. They go, oh my God, I can't sit through this anymore. But it is important in terms of, and it's important in terms of understanding that scenarios are not a science. They're really an art form. Remarkable people. You need to surround yourself with remarkable people. I've been blessed the last 2 or 3 months in working with the water assembly folks. These are all volunteers. I'm a volunteer today, who just have used their entire life's experience to look at this particular agenda item for future generations and take the time out, not just this Saturday, but many other Saturdays and other days of the week, to see if there's something that they can do to make a better future for the next generation. And so we're blessed with water assembly folks, all the ones that I've met so far, even the ones that are contrary on the emails that we've had and represent a diverse perspective. They're all committed and dedicated and bring a set of knowledge and perspectives to this work that's pretty remarkable. You need a champion for this effort, and you certainly have that in the water assembly. I'd like to think that over the next year, as we develop these scenarios, publicize them, get more people involved, that we'll even have champions up in Santa Fe. And understanding the mental maps of decision makers is an important aspect of scenario planning. No matter what it is that you are convinced of is the right way to go, if you don't understand what the drivers are for your decision makers, your policy makers, your politicians, your governor, if you don't understand what their mindset is, you're not going to get there. So you have to sort of get outside of the box that you're in and say, okay, let me try to understand why the Speaker of the House said that, or why the governor said this. And is there a way that I can bring a story forward to them to convince them that that perhaps might not be the best way to look at it? This is how scenarios are created, and some of this work has already been done by the Water Assembly folks over the past year. An environmental scan looking at all the data that's out there. They engaged university folks. They've talked to a number of individuals, including policymakers. They've looked at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in the regions. All of these things also went into the creation of the 2004 Water Plan. They continue to look at driving forces. And predetermined events are also something that we look at. For example, we know there's going to be a presidential election coming up in 2012. That's a predetermined event. We just don't know who's going to be elected. So what you do is you take all of that information, and you identify, hopefully, what two critical uncertainties are, those things that are most critical to the future about the subject you're talking about, but are most uncertain. And that creates a set of axes, and within each one of those quadrants that are created by that set of axes is a future world. So this is a little bit bigger picture of that. Along each one of these critical uncertainty axes, what you typically do is describe what the extreme endpoints are of those axes. Those are the descriptors of each one of those critical uncertainties. To create future world W, you take all the extreme descriptors here and all of the extreme descriptors here, and you meld them together. And you say, if all of these occurred and all of these occurred, what would this future world look like out here? And you do that for each of the quadrants. This is a set of scenarios I developed for Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sig Hecker, back in 1998, where there was a great concern about the global nuclear danger and the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies. And the axis that we chose was the proliferation of nuclear weapon states. Over time, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had kept this to a smaller number than originally predicted, but there were indications back in the 1990s that more and more states were moving towards developing their own nuclear weapons. And then the other axis, which is a little hard to see, is the theft and diversion of nuclear materials. Won't go into this in any great detail, other than to indicate that prior to 9/11, we were identifying, as a result of these scenarios, a possible scenario where terrorists would in fact be the dominant force in that world. And we discussed many of the activities that are going on at the laboratory today to diminish the role of nuclear terrorism in our world. One of the things that will probably happen after this meeting today is that we'll ask you, perhaps at the end of your session, to think about strategies in each one of the future worlds that you create on how we might address that particular world. What should we be doing, or what things might be done to make that world a better place to live in, or to perhaps even change that future path. One of the remarkable things that happens in scenario planning is that when you develop those strategies for each one of these worlds, invariably you'll find that there are 2 or 3 strategies in each one of those worlds that are similar. Those become your robust strategies, and strategies that can be undertaken and acted upon so that you're prepared for any one of those future worlds. As time goes on and you revisit scenarios based on the events that are occurring, you can actually track events that dominate into a particular world. And in addition to the robust strategies that you work on, you can also look at the strategies that were unique to that world and say, maybe we ought to be adding 1 or 2 of these things. In this particular set of scenarios that we developed in 1998 and revisited with the laboratory in 2000, we identified a growing concern that the technologies that were available to non-state groups, terrorist groups, had the potential for impacting millions of lives and the economies of the world in trillions of dollars. And we talked about in a preamble to a set of scenarios I wrote at that time, the consequences of inaction by world leaders if they did not react to the events that were occurring. And it struck me the other night as I was rereading the story that that's basically what the story scenario was about. What would happen if we did nothing about our current situation with water use in the Middle Rio Grande region, the inaction of policymakers. This then is the set of scenarios that Lucy will talk about, now that I'm 3 minutes over my time here. We have chosen energy availability as the horizontal axis, where on one extreme energy is scarce and expensive, and I think we're seeing that happen today. Or on the other extreme, energy is plentiful and relatively cheap. The orthogonal axis that we've chosen is water availability. And again, the simple concept here, it's plentiful and cheap. Certainly that's the case this morning with the rain we have, but in the long run, is that going to be the case, or is water going to be scarce and expensive? And as Lucy will talk about in her presentation, when you use the descriptors that you'll create for each one of these extreme axes, those will create a future world that then will allow you to construct the events and timeline and the story for that future world.
Thank you, Jack.